Okay, we're live. Welcome everyone to another edition of our Thank God It's Monday webinar series. Today we're especially honored to have with us one of the co-founders of the Conscious Capitalism movement. He served as a trustee of Conscious Capitalism Inc. for 12 years and is the co-author of the Conscious Capitalism Field Guide, as well as coach of business leaders willing to build great and resilient corporate cultures. He is Timothy Henry, and today he wants to make a very unique statement. Organizational resilience is going to be the new normal. That's his claim. Timothy, thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely my pleasure to join you, Xavi.
Fantastic. So I guess most of our audience are familiar with conscious capitalism, but maybe some are not. So why don't we quickly start with a very brief definition of conscious capitalism, what conscious capitalism means to you?
Okay, well, let me tell that by telling the story of how we actually began, because we started a little over 12 years ago at a retreat at John Mackey's ranch. John Mackey is the CEO of Whole Foods. And it was a number of CEOs and consultants and some academics, and we got together and we had this question that many of these companies like Patagonia, the Container Store, Whole Foods, Starbucks were asking, which is, we're incredibly successful. We're the most profitable businesses in our sectors, almost uniformly. And yet we operate differently. And when we're together, we feel there's a common framework we use for discussing what our success is based on. And what was fascinating was that they say when we go out and talk to the world, we feel like we're strangers in a strange land. Nobody speaks the same language. So out of that, we said, okay, there's something in common. And what do we think those common elements are that make these really great, high-performing businesses? And we came to the conclusion there were about 4 elements of that. One was that a company had a purpose, and that purpose was more than making money. Second, that there was a stakeholder orientation, that the company was looking across all of its stakeholders and saying, how do we create a win-win ecosystem here, where if everybody benefits, the shareholders will also benefit? And then to support that, how do we help create conscious leaders and conscious cultures that help this come to realization in how a company operates day to day? So those were sort of the 4 elements, and the background was a group of companies who 12 years ago, when we started talking about purpose and stakeholders, people thought we were mad. I mean, they were purpose, what is that? Stakeholders, who are those? And now today it's fascinating because it's common parlance, and there's a lot of discussion going on about purpose and stakeholder capitalism.
So let's go to today. That was 12 years ago, and today we're in the middle of a huge crisis caused by an apparently seamless virus. What does COVID-19 mean for conscious business, for conscious capitalism?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question, and some people are, talking about it in terms of, will this be a setback because companies are going to go to survival mode? Or is this actually a time when we're going to accelerate towards a tipping point where more and more companies will see this as the best way to operate? Now, no surprise, I'm in the latter case of thinking that this is really going to help us accelerate to a tipping point. And I want to first caveat that by saying, listen, there are a lot of businesses out there today that are in survival mode for whom this is devastating. There are some estimates, for example, in the retail restaurant business that, up to 1/3 of restaurants are not going to be here in 12 months from now because of the dire straits they find themselves under. So I want to be realistic and say that there are a lot of businesses that are in survival mode. Now, holding those aside, I think there are also a lot of other businesses that are responding very differently to the crisis, who aren't necessarily in survival mode, who have some options. And for the sake of this discussion, I'll call them, there's the saints and the sinners. Those that are doing a good job and those that are maybe not doing such a good job. And I would also say there's some preliminary data coming back that seems to support that the saints are doing better right now in terms of some performance metrics than others. For example, Forbes and Just Capital just released last week a study that was showing for the Fortune 100 how the top 25 performers under a stakeholder approach right now to this versus the bottom 25. And they were comparing their performance in terms of stock returns over the last 5 months. Clearly, massive differences in performance between the top 25 and the bottom 25. So we're starting to see, in a sense, there's my favorite quote I have about this, which is from Warren Buffett, who said, listen, when the tide goes out, we find out who's been swimming naked.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and in a sense, we're finding out now who are those companies that really take purpose and people and a stakeholder approach seriously, and those who have not.
And why do you think that the saints are doing better?
Well, I think it comes down to something we spoke about in the book when we were talking about the stakeholder approach. If you're really taking a true stakeholder approach that's underpinned by a strong purpose, then you have an orientation towards business, which says we're looking at a long-term relational model with our stakeholders versus some other companies who have been in operation mode where it's been very short-term and very transactional. Now, those companies that are more short-term transactional have often responded in a very reactive way, sort of how do we slash and burn and get our costs down now? And that's very different than the other group of companies who are taking a more relational point of view, making a long-term point of view. And I'll pick L'Oreal as one example. So L'Oreal, one of the things they've done is say, listen, for our smaller and medium-sized suppliers, we recognize they're at financial risk. So we're going to pay them as fast as possible, if not instantaneously, rather than, as other companies have done, stretch their 30-day payment terms to 90 days to preserve cash. L'Oreal took a different approach. For our survival and our ability to bounce back, we're going to need these suppliers. So we want them to survive. How can we help them survive? And no coincidence, they've done the same thing with some of their smaller retailers, where they've gone and said, for some of our smaller mom and pop retailers, we're going to stretch the payment terms for them. So rather than the normal 30-day terms, we'll stretch it to 90 days because they recognize that they're an important part of their overall ecosystem and they need those people to survive. So how can they support them at a downturn like this?
Okay, so that's in a way what you're saying is these companies, by operating in this manner, they are building a sort of resilience in totally counterintuitive ways.
Yeah, exactly. I think that one of the topics that people are spending a lot of time talking about is that word, resilience. Now, on the one hand, it's been most obvious in terms of the discussion of resilient supply chains. People are looking and saying, hey, listen, for those that had supply chains that started in Wuhan back in January and February, they were immediately impacted and they started to see how vulnerable some of their supply chains can be. So certainly there's a lot of attention by almost everybody of sort of looking at their supply chain now and saying, how resilient is our supply chain? Now, conversely, I think they're also starting to look and see how resilient has our organization been. And I think that as we think about some of the best businesses, they've been looking at this crisis in terms of 3 phases. The first phase was survival. How do we get to a point where we're shutting down and shutting down well and ensuring that we have the cash to continue to survive over the short, medium term? The second phase they've been looking at is like, what's our comeback strategy? Like, how do we reopen? What does that mean? And for the more insightful companies, they're also looking out and saying, there's going to be a new normal, whether it's here in 12 months or 18 months or 24 months, we don't know, but we need to be thinking about what that's going to look like. Now, when you have that kind of longer term time frame, the resilience of your organization becomes very important. If you took a very much of a slash and burn kind of approach to survive in phase 1, you didn't have a lot of energy that you were building in the firm, nor a lot of motivation for people to be thinking about what the new normal is going to look like. And I would argue that none of us have a crystal ball on what that new normal is going to look like, but we know it's going to be different. It's not going to be the same. So those organizations that are positioning themselves organizationally to be able to respond very quickly. You know, those favorite words, they're going to be agile, they're going to be adaptive, they're going to be great innovators. Now more than ever, that's going to be true. And the saints are going to come out of this with a reservoir of trust, loyalty, and engagement from their people and from their suppliers, in contrast to the sinners who are going to come out of this, and they're going to have environments where there's a low level of trust. In many cases, people are embarrassed to have been seen how their companies have reacted. Now, you just think about it. You know, who would you rather have on your team? The demoralized people who aren't trusting management, or those that are coming out inspired by the way they feel their company has handled this? And when we get into that new normal, that's where we're going to start to see a big gap in performance between those two companies. And I think that's why, you know, people and purpose are going to be more important than ever as we come out into the new normal.
That's very interesting, because last week we actually had a very interesting, not the week, last week, the week before, we had a very interesting conversation on trust, actually. And we were talking about some of the things that you were just saying, how trust is vital. And definitely trust in the context of an organization is very much connected to the culture. Some cultures generate trust, some generate the opposite. And after you come out of a crisis, if you come out of the crisis, those that had a culture that generated trust, as you were saying, will be in a much better position to have a competitive advantage, a competitive edge with respect to the others.
Yeah. I think so. It also applies to brands. I think that your brand, you know, is either going to be developing trust or not developing trust. And, you know, there are some interesting examples. You know, there's Barbour's, which is the maker of a very famous sort of classical English waxed leather coat. You know, they took one of their production facilities and turned it over into making medical gowns for their local NHS. Now, you think about what that does when they're able to look at that and sort of say, look how they responded. Or in the US, Verizon, which is really ranked by Forbes as one of the #1 responders, they shut down almost 70% of their stores. But then they shifted those workers into online customer service and sales roles. Thousands of people in a matter of a month, they shifted in their roles. Huge investment in L&D and training to get them there. But they've been able, one, to maintain some degree of service at a time when everybody's trying to connect in and get information about their wireless and their payments and everything else. They've been able to, you know, almost double the size of their customer service organization in a very short period of time by reassigning and developing people in new ways. That's going to pay big dividends for the customers, and it's going to pay big dividends in terms of the way the employees feel about how their company responded.
It's a completely different type of ROI, right? So this is all very interesting, but maybe some people may wonder, okay, that sounds great. Now, how do I go about developing this sort of company that has this type of resilience based on a strong culture, purpose, etc.? What's the magic formula to go down that path?
Well, I'm not sure there's ever a silver bullet to these, but we certainly know the direction of travel. And the caveat I will put in is that I can tell you what it takes to get there, and yet it's going to take any organization that starts on this 2 or 3 years to get there. So I put that caveat in by saying there are no short-run answers to this. There are things that you do in the short run to begin to build credibility in your organization around this, but there's no shortcuts. And so I would step back and say that the two things that are most important are clearly purpose and people. And the fundamental piece underneath that is around purpose, creating meaning for people in the workforce, and the people focus, creating a sense of caring. So at a high level, those are what you're trying to create in your culture. You want people to have a sense of meaning at work, and you want to feel that they're cared for, because if those things are true, then you will start to see pickups in terms of performance and people willing to take risks and try new things, versus, as we said earlier, a fear-based culture where a different set of dynamics play. So we begin with purpose, and we sort of say, okay, a lot of work has happened in the last few years about companies finding their purpose or discovering it. And I really think that's one of the first places you start. Can you articulate clearly what your purpose is? And then secondly, what's your ambition for that purpose? You know, like if you live your purpose, how big an impact are you going to have on the world? And can you clearly articulate what that impact might be? So that's the first element. The second element becomes one of how to make the purpose matter inside your business. So here the question becomes one of, can you make it credible? Can you make it relevant? And can you make it meaningful inside your business? And the relevant part begins with, can I make this relevant to the business that we're in? Can people see how our purpose and what we do almost on a day-to-day basis as a business, that these things make sense? And you can explain it clearly to me how, in a very practical way, our purpose impacts our day-to-day business. The credibility comes from looking at management and sort of saying, hey, are they really walking the talk on this? You know, or was it a wonderful kickoff with a beautiful video about an inspirational purpose, and then, you know, we never see them again, or we never hear about it again? And then finally, the meaningful part is to make it relevant to the individual. How does the individual in their role create a line of sight between what they do on a day-to-day basis and what we're trying to do as an organization? If they can make that meaningful, if they can make it relevant to the business, and they can make it credible, then you'll start to have a purpose that matters.
So you basically, everything seems to be very much purpose-centric. I mean, there are 4 pillars in conscious capitalism, but from your explanation, it looks like everything pivots around purpose. Like nothing makes sense without a purpose, right? I mean, purpose is like the central pillar of everything, because sometimes people get confused about that.
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, the one of the first markers is, do you have a purpose? And what difference are you making in the world because of your purpose? I mean, it's not a very difficult question. You know, if you don't have a purpose, then it's really kind of an interesting dialogue.
Okay, so no, but the reason I'm asking this question is because many times we talk to people that have decent companies, but they have not really manifested their purpose. They behave consciously, they treat their stakeholders nicely, their employees, and they have a nice culture, but they don't seem, they don't have, let's say, a higher purpose. And they actually get kind of lost when you tell them about conscious capitalism and this concept of having a higher purpose. Sometimes they feel, okay, and unless I have a purpose like Google, I'm nobody, right? So sometimes people get a little bit confused with the idea of higher purpose, this sense of grandiosity that people think, unless I have a huge purpose, you know, a bakery is purposeless, you know? So, so maybe you could shed some light there. Maybe it's in terms of making clear that you don't need to have a huge purpose, but you need to understand what your purpose to society is.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, at some level, it's a really interesting question, because every business that's started, almost, let's say 80% of them, the entrepreneurs started with the idea that there was a problem they were trying to solve. All right. Bill Gates, for example, did not found Microsoft on the idea of, I want to be the richest man in the world. He started off, whether he could state that purpose or not at the time. In retrospect, he can state it, but at the time, you know, it wasn't as obvious. But his view was that he was trying to democratize computing. He was trying to move from these big, massive rooms with these huge computers and put a computer on everybody's desktop, in a sense, democratizing access to computers. Now, he couldn't have articulated that clearly at that time. Later on, he was able to do that. So I would argue that for most entrepreneurs, it's about discovering and going back to the roots of why did you start this business? What problem in the world were you trying to solve? And then from there, you start to say, and what's the impact of that? Why is the world a better place because we're doing that? And that one can be something that's of value to customers. It can be something that's of value to my employees. It can, but there's a number of different ways people can answer that. But it doesn't always have to be, I'm, solving world hunger. It can be something like I'm trying to create meaningful workplaces where people and communities are better because we're here. And that may be what the purpose of the business is. And then it can be very focused on having a great culture and being a wonderful place to work and having a positive impact on its culture while it's doing its business.
That alone would be a great purpose, right? It's not, I guess, as long as we have a clear sense that we have a purpose that serves society, and our ultimate purpose is not filling up our pocket with money, we're fine. We need to understand that money is the oxygen that runs our ultimate purpose, not the purpose in itself, right?
Well, it's interesting because right at the beginning we had this discussion about what we meant by a higher purpose. And I'll tell you, in the beginning, we sort of went back to Plato, and we sort of said Plato talked about truth, the good, beauty, and then John Mackey wanted to add a fourth one, which we said heroic. And we said, if you could line up and somehow describe your purpose around one of those four dimensions, then you were good. So truth might be if you were a pharmaceutical company, you're doing research on cutting edge, let's say, vaccines for coronavirus, right? You'd have a purpose, and you could say that was. Now, what's interesting is the debate is evolving, and now more and more people are sort of saying, listen, let's look at the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and can we in some way draw a line between where we are today and our purpose hitting one of those things? So, for example, recently had this debate about Coke, and people were saying, well, Coca-Cola, they've said one of the things they're really focused on is taking care of water and being concerned about water. And as they try to implement that, they can draw a line of sight between that and what one of their 17 Sustainable Development Goals is, which is around clean water for everyone.
Yep.
So there's an example of a company that traditionally you would think of what's the higher purpose of Coca-Cola, and they're working on it. They're trying to find ways in which they can create something that's meaningful. It's work in process, but water is one of those critical things where they think they're creating a good company that is good for the planet in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, let me. I think this conversation is bringing up flashbacks from a previous webinar it was on last week. So let me actually recover some of the ideas that came up in that other webinar, which means I'm going to get a little bit philosophical about this concept of purpose in business, and what's the purpose of business, the ultimate purpose of business. I remember that we talked about the idea that, well, it's not an idea, it's a well-known fact that the lifespan of businesses is shrinking year after year. And I think now it's like 18 years, whereas 70 years ago, it was 60 years. So it's down by 2/3 of what it used to be. So in a session with Salim Ismail a few weeks ago, we talked about the reason for that, which is that technology is dematerializing and demonetizing businesses at exponential speed. Now, a collateral effect of that is that as technology takes over, some types of jobs disappear and new ones emerge. And so far, the new jobs have emerged faster than the ones that disappeared. But the thing is that right now, what's starting to happen is that even these new jobs are being demonetized faster and faster every day. So it looks like inevitably at some point in the future, we don't know exactly how close this future is going to be, but at some point, technology will destroy jobs at a faster rate then it creates new ones. Now, here's where the philosophical part of the question comes. Could we say that at the point we reach this sort of escape velocity, the velocity at which technology destroys jobs faster than it creates them, we're effectively escaping a world of scarcity and entering a world of abundance where technology does pretty much everything that today requires human labor and frees us up from slavery of work? Is that the ultimate purpose of capitalism, taking us there?
That's a pretty big question. And, I think it'll take more than 5 minutes to answer it. But what I do want to put in that context is that even with the evolution or revolution around AI and robotics, those organizations that are going to use AI and robotics best are going to conversely be those organizations that are most human. And what I mean by that is I go back to my opening statements about meaning in the workplace and people feeling cared for. Those organizations that are able to create those kind of high trust, high engagement cultures are much more likely to be innovative and find new and exciting ways to take advantage of these new technologies and therefore to prosper, versus those companies that again, back to this fear-based, top-down hierarchical culture where people are not going to be innovative. They're going to resist any kind of change that ends up coming at them through digitalization, et cetera. It was interesting last week, listening to a professor at INSEAD talk about digital transformation. And she said the two biggest blocks by far to digital transformation are culture and mindsets. And if you're trying to change a culture or you're trying to change mindsets and you don't have high degrees of trust and high degrees of engagement, good luck. It's not going to happen. So the answer I can give you is that those organizations that create these kind of environments and have the kind of leadership that can adjust to this new world are going to be those that are going to prosper. And those companies are going to be more human kinds of organizations rather than our top-down hierarchical cog in a wheel business that we have from the 20th century.
Okay, that's an interesting point of view. I remember in that webinar I was talking about, actually the conclusion was that more human-based organizations probably we're going to, or in the future, we're going towards a model of company where there will be no humans at all, or almost no humans. Even the CEO will be an AI. But at the same time, rather than businesses, we'll be talking about some sort of commons, so infrastructures of the common. But that's definitely a very long conversation, and we're running out of time, definitely. And I definitely also want to ask our audience to ask some questions. In fact, we already have 2 of them. So let me go and read them real quick so that you can address them.
Okay.
Let's go with the first one. Looking at natural ecosystems, resilience is a property linked to the fact that all individuals and species contribute somehow to the robustness of the system. They both benefit from and nurture the ecosystem. Why is it so difficult for human organizations to proceed in the same way?
That's a really good question.
Why? Are we part of nature?
and here's the conundrum that lies behind that, because I can sit down and I can show you lots of compelling data that shows why purpose-driven businesses are more profitable and more successful. I can do the same thing now with resilience and companies with high psychological safety, which all are related to that question of sort of naturally oriented businesses. And yet, there are still many in the business world who have a traditional business narrative that says, no, that can't possibly be so. So I think that, part of what lies behind the conscious capitalism movement is making the case that there are lots of businesses that do operate that way, do think that way, and they're very profitable and very successful. And slowly over time, we're beginning to change the narrative and beginning to change the expectations that we have of really good businesses. And it's a slow movement on the one hand. On the other hand, 10 years ago, I couldn't be having this kind of dialogue without being thought of as being some kind of weirdo progressive person, versus, actually there's some really good hard-nosed reasons why this is just a better way to do business. And I would say that question really underpins that yes, that kind of resilience is critical to success in a highly uncertain, quickly changing world. If you don't have that ability to adapt quickly, that kind of resilience, you're not going to thrive in this new normal, whatever that turns out to be.
Sure. Let me go with the second question. Isn't there a cultural component to the purpose to be considered? I mean that the purpose of an organization, according to a dominant culture that favors profit, has always been clear: to make money. When the culture changes, the purpose changes as well, but the process is slow.
Yeah, well, this goes back to, having a purpose isn't enough. Having a purpose that matters is what's critical. So it's not just that it's words, it's you've made it operational. You've made it relevant to people. They can understand how this fits with our business, how when we serve our customers better, that results in us prospering better. It relates to when we work with our stakeholders and we work with them in a more productive way. We understand that makes us a better, stronger business. And ultimately, that better, stronger business will be more profitable. But it switches and says that, listen, profit is an outcome. The inputs to that are this stakeholder orientation, this culture of people first. Now, having said that, and back to your point about, starting with purpose, having said all of that, the key enablers, there's 3 key enablers to being able to do this. And those 3 key enablers are leadership, leadership, and leadership. In the end, if the leaders themselves don't have a strong belief that this is a better way of doing business, and don't themselves understand what kind of leadership is required, the emotional intelligence, the ability to communicate and listen well, to put your ego in the back seat rather than in the forefront. If you don't have the leaders that can lead that way, then there's always going to be a difficulty here in terms of this being credible in an organization and staying with it for the 2 or 3 or 4 years that it takes to really start seeing the deep results.
Definitely. So there's one more question, even though we're out of time, we're gonna do it, and that will be the last question. If the purpose of a community is to prosper, taking into account all the parties involved, including the environment, shouldn't the purpose of an organization to offer a good, an idea, or a service that helps the community to prosper in that sense?
Say that again. I think I'm not sure I caught that entirely.
If the purpose of a community is to prosper, taking into account all the parties involved, including the environment, all the stakeholders, shouldn't the purpose of an organization be to offer a good, an idea, or a service that helps the community to prosper in that sense?
Yes, I think that the question is, your purpose needs to be connected to a value that you're delivering or creating in the world. And the question becomes one of, what is that value? Who values it? And how are we examining and articulating what that value is? Now, more and more, we're looking at this and saying it's, not just financial value that a company creates. A company creates social value, it creates natural capital, it creates human capital. And as we look at what long-term, sustainable, viable business models look like, we have to look across all 4 types of capital and say, if we're going to have financial capital in order to keep breathing, let's make sure we're not destroying capital in these other places, but let's be creative and look for where are the opportunities for us to create value with our people, with the communities we work in, and with the environment. So sustainability, for example, becomes a question of, it's not because we're told we have to, but it's because we're looking creatively at how we can create opportunities to create value for our business through a more sustainable business model, either through cutting costs, managing risks, or finding new opportunities for which we can exploit, because we're the first mover in a more sustainable business model.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, now we're definitely out of time, so we're going to have to leave it here. But before we do, and as usual, as you know, Timothy, we always ask our last guest who he would like to interview next. So that's the question we are asking you now before we go. Who would you like us to interview, and what kind of question would you like to ask him or her?
Well, I'm going to suggest two people, because you and I spoke about who I might nominate, and I haven't heard back from them. But one of them is in the impact investment world. Tom Hazlett is a former executive at Putnam Management, one of the big investment houses in the US. And he runs, with a couple of other former Putnam executives, a group called Tilt, which has really looked at impact investing and how can they make that real. The other person that I would suggest is a fellow by the name of Ed Boyd, who runs a think tank in the UK called Regenerate. And the purpose of Regenerate is to make the UK the best place in the world for purpose-driven businesses to grow and thrive. So they're trying to look at how do we balance government policy, market-based mechanisms to create a policy and a regulatory environment where purpose-driven businesses can thrive and be world leaders in that way. So I'll throw that out to you and see which one you find most interesting.
It's going to be hard to choose. Both seem like great candidates. Thanks a lot, Timothy. It's been a pleasure sharing this time with you. Thanks for saving some of your precious time to be with us today. And we hope that your prediction that this new normal will be connected with resilient organizations that have grown these people-centric cultures become true.
Thank you, Xavi. It's been an honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. And my challenge to everybody who listens to this is, what's your role in helping to make sure the new normal is a tipping point towards more conscious businesses? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we go, or?
No, I think that's it. You all have a role. Let's go play those roles and make sure that we collectively move to that new normal in a way that does represent these values and ways of doing business.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us live. As usual, we will post the video on YouTube tomorrow morning, and you will have it available there. Also remind you that the next session next Monday is going to be with Helen Erickson. She's a business psychologist and author of Change Doesn't Ask for Permission, something that COVID-19 has definitely taught us the hard way. So thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you next Monday in another exciting edition of our Thank God It's Monday webinar series. Thank you.